fiery spear from heaven. In Hebrew legends, Lucifer's fall from the war in heaven was like a mighty fireball streaking from heaven, trailing a tail like a fiery dragon. The fall from heaven resembled a meteorite that came from the fiery eye of God's throne, like a falling star.
In cosmology, whether Chaldean, Babylonian, Assyrian, Hebrew, we often see that the seed of the earth came from the heavens. And in Babylonian cosmology, the area that we call the asteroid belt, which every day sends down many asteroids, whether small or large, into our atmosphere and can turn into meteorites that then blaze through the sky as if the heavens were seeding the earth, is oftentimes forgotten that that was a planet called Marduk, which exploded because it too early became quite solidified. And so what we have as meteorites are absolute wonders of all stages of a planet in its formation. And the Hebrew legends of the Zohar and Sefer Yetzirah and many other sources tell some of these legends that are so profound that when we look at them in relationship to Saint Michael and the mysteries of the Grail, they reveal a tremendous amount.
Meteorites brought the gift of fire from the sky and the precious metals and crystals inside. Tubal-Cain was the son of Cain, who was noted for his brilliance in fashioning tools for living. He was known as the first smithy who forged metal, even from the iron and nickel found in meteorites.
Tubal-Cain, the son of Cain, of course, was known as the great fashioner of materials, and it is seldom ever referenced that he worked with meteorites and basically turned from the age of bronze to the age of iron by using meteorites in a mix to create swords and spears and shields. And these mysteries of Tubal-Cain are very powerful, and they lead us right into the mysteries of the crucifixion and the spear of Longinus, which we'll address in just a moment. But Tubal-Cain was this wise smithy who watched the skies for the gifts that the gods would send down, and then was wise enough to know what to do with them.
Legend has it that Tubal-Cain found a great meteorite that God told him to forge into a very special sword and spear that together would be invincible. As long as the bearer of the weapon never separated the sword and spear, they could not be defeated. Tubal-Cain was instructed to hide the weapons deep among rocks at the top of a mountain until the time would come that they would be needed.
In the age of Tubal-Cain, the war between Cain and Abel had already played itself out, and truly Tubal-Cain was not interested in fomenting war, but he did follow God's instructions, made a spear and a sword that were a pair. And that pair, throughout Hebrew history, as you look into the Old Testament, you can find the way that that spear and that sword were found, separated, and used both separately and together to win many wars. And that spear later became a very famous spear called the spear of Phinehas. Well, Tubal-Cain was not the one who would wield this sword and this spear, which was indicative of the sword and the spear that is oftentimes associated with the archangel Michael that was used to cast Lucifer from heaven. But this spear and this sword became terrestrial, powerful weapons that were given by the divine.
This same spear was still used at the time of Jesus of Nazareth and was carried out to the Mount of the Skull, Golgotha, by the Sanhedrin during the crucifixion. This spear was considered to be the authority and witness when the Sanhedrin condemned someone to death.
It is very little known, the tradition of Phinehas, who was the grandson of Aaron, the brother of Moses. And in the Holy of Holies, the spear of Phinehas was kept because it was seen not only as a witness to the truth of what the teachings of the Hebrews were all about, but it was also the symbol of the purification of the Hebrew blood, for that spear had been used by Phinehas to in fact stop a Hebrew from having sex with a Midianite woman. And this symbol of the spear of Phinehas was one that said, "We have the right to take your life if you do not follow the law." And this spear was still used at the time of Jesus Christ and during his crucifixion, and was in fact brought out as the authorization for the Sanhedrin to commit Jesus to the horrible death of crucifixion, because very rarely did the Sanhedrin actually get to put anyone to death, and it was only for blasphemy that they put him to death, because they said that he had claimed himself to be the king of the Jews.
Roman Catholics also revere meteorites and have built numerous churches at the site of a meteor fall. These churches were dedicated to the Archangel Michael, and the meteorite is often incorporated into a statue of Michael holding Lucifer, the dragon, at bay.
It was much to my surprise to find that Mount Gorgano, Mount Saint-Michel in Brittany, and Mount St. Michael and St. Peter's all have meteorites incorporated into statues of St. Michael, basically conquering or holding Lucifer at bay. It was much to my surprise to realize that the Catholic Church had incorporated this concept of animism, that a meteorite is a living divine being, as they believe in Indonesia and in Java and in Bali, and that it was incorporated into the Catholic Church as a symbol, not only as the spear or sword of Michael, but oftentimes as the shield of Michael, a very small shield, in fact, that looks more like a dish or a cup, reminiscent of what we would call the Holy Grail.
It is likely that Longinus' spear would have been made with meteorite, and the spear of Phinehas, also made with meteoric metal, was brought to Golgotha as the authority to put Jesus to death. The spiritual spear of Longinus opposed the Hebrew spear of Phinehas that had been used for so much death and war.
It is well known that in Palestine, that the spearhead of a centurion was made with meteorite in it, and by such made it much harder than normal. So it was called a centurion hasta, but it was called a nova magus, which means a new spearhead created with meteorite. This was critical because in meteorite was not only arsenic and cobalt and all of the metals and elements needed to transform bronze into iron, but literally iron into steel because of the carbon and the other substances in meteorite. So when we speak of the spear of Longinus, we are undoubtedly speaking of a spear that had been impregnated and mixed in with meteorite to make it harder than the spearhead of any other Roman soldier. So we can see meteorite involved in the spearhead of Longinus, and we know that Tubal-Cain took a meteorite and turned it into what we now know as the spear of Phinehas. Those two stand as a counterbalance to one another. One, a gift from the heavens that was divine, and the other one, a weapon of war that was transformed into a weapon of love, the spear of Longinus, the spear of mercy.
Animistic beliefs in the living nature of meteorites is most pronounced in Indonesia, particularly Java. It was tradition that every male Javanese have a special knife or spear called a kris that was revered as a living god if it contained meteorite. These knives and spears were made of 3 parts that were often fashioned by 3 different artists. The blade was forged, and then the smithy would determine if the blade had a good or a bad spirit to it. Generally, a kris with meteorite was seen as good and filled with the dragon or serpent force that was seen in the tail of the meteorite as it fell to earth.
These animistic beliefs still go on to this very day, and they are the sacred heart of the religion of Indonesia and Java. These krises adorn every temple and every home, and they are usually kept quite separate so that the scabbard or the vessel that holds this meteorite that has been hammered into the shape of a dragon's tail, or basically the meteorite tail that they would see falling from the sky. Once this meteorite had hit the ground, not only did it bring fire and iron and literally the capacity to create steel, but it also had in it a divine being. And only the priests would work with a meteorite and hammer it into a blade that then they would know was either good or ill. Depending upon whether it was good or ill, they would create a special scabbard to hold it, to in fact embody, to hold the power of that blade. And then on top of it, the identity of that being would be described by the handle that was put on the end of the kris. So it's a 3-part blade made by 3 different artists usually, and the ones who forged it were oftentimes in a trance, and they would not only forge and meld these meteorites into these kris swords and kris knives, but they would use their lips to cool the blade after they had hammered it. They would be in a trance, and in this trance they would go in direct contact with the spiritual being that they were working with, and it wouldn't even burn their lips as they would cool the blades with their lips. And you can see the lip imprints on many of these blades. This is the type of power and connection that people believed these gifts from the sky, this spiritual seeding of the earth, brought down to the earth so that those on the earth could work with these divine forces.
Christ was like a meteor descending from the throne of God. The flaming sword of Michael was present at the crucifixion. The spear of Longinus was made with meteoric metal, and the vessel of Joseph of Arimathea was a green stone that fell from heaven. None of these legendary and historical stories detract from the mystery of Golgotha, but in fact enhance and enrich the beliefs.
To say that animism is incorporated in Christianity is partially true, but what they're looking at is the living spirit behind substances that have been touched by cosmic forces, forces outside of the realm of the earth, forces from the planets, forces from the sun, forces from the sky and the heavens where these things fell from. So when we're looking at the olivine that may have been inside of one of these meteorites, this olivine crystal had fallen into the land of Tyre, and the king of Tyre had taken this crystal and carved it into a chalice, which was then given to Solomon, and it was called Solomon's chalice. If this is true, then it is a meteorite that provided the very vessel that caught the blood of Christ. It was, in fact, the being of the archangel Michael, who led the blind hand of Longinus to pierce the side of Christ in a merciful way so that his legs would not have to be broken and him suffer and endure even more humiliation on the cross. For Christ had already died, and the spear of mercy stabbing the side of the Christ demonstrated that in the way that the water and the blood had already separated and flowed from the wound of Christ into the chalice that was being held by Joseph of Arimathea. Again, Michael led the blind hand of Longinus, and so therefore one can even say that the archangel Michael led the spear of Longinus into the side of Christ, and the stone that Michael had struck from the crown of Lucifer had then been transformed into this green chalice, this bowl of Solomon, which was used then to catch the blood of Christ.
The efficacy of the Roman Catholic blood relics is really a matter of personal belief and individual faith. The Holy Grail essentially is the wisdom of the East that prefigured Christ and the transformation of those beliefs into a living experience of the cosmic Christ and the personal Christ within our own spirit. The most common imagination of the Holy Grail is one of an otherworldly vision of the chalice and spear that floats in a living realm above the earth and calls the seeker to discover its nature and meaning and to ask the question, whom does the Grail serve?
And so the Grail does not necessarily ever come to the earth in terms of a spiritual manifestation. It is the image of the other side of yourself, the spiritual side of yourself, often seen as a vessel that is receiving the descent of the Spirit, whether in the form of a holy bird or a Holy Spirit or a winged angel or the host, which represents the body of Christ, or the host representing the sun or the moon. No matter how you want to look at it, it is that Spirit that is flowing in to the vessel of the Holy Grail that we are speaking of. And this happens in the human heart. So whether or not we can look into the outer world and see cosmological references and manifestations to animistic forces that remind us of these spiritual aspects of ourself that are seeded from the divine realm of the heavens, it is the same image that we have with the open human heart receiving the consciousness of the higher I as it descends into the heart, that is, in fact, the true Holy Grail that is available for every human being. And Christ and Christ's mission and the mystery of Golgotha and the manifestation of the Holy Grail through the mystery of Golgotha are all examples of what we can find also in our own human body.